When you watch this movie, the first thing that hits you isn't the story, it's the faces. These aren't just actors playing gangsters. These are guys who've been doing this so long, they don't have to raise their voices to scare you. De Niro barely moves half the time, but every look, every pause, it tells you something. He doesn't play this guy like a tough guy out to prove something. He plays him quiet, careful, like a man who's always measuring the room, always watching who's talking and who's not. That part, that feels real. I've sat across from guys like that. The dangerous ones don't advertise it. And then there's Pesci. Everybody remembers him for being loud, explosive, smashing bottles over people's heads. That's not what he does here. This time he's calm, controlled, almost gentle. And that's what makes him terrifying. He talks soft, he smiles, he touches your cheek like he cares about you. But the whole time, you know, if he decides you're done, you're done. No drama, no speeches, just over. That's closer to how real power works. The boss doesn't scream, the boss doesn't have to. When he speaks, everybody listens because they know what comes next if they don't. The chemistry between those two is what sells the whole thing. You believe their history, without it ever being spelled out. You believe they've done things together, covered things up together, buried things together. They don't need exposition. It's all in the way they sit, the way they share space, the way silence hangs between them. That's something you can't fake unless you've lived a few decades on screen together or you really understand the world you're portraying. Now, I'll give credit where it's due. These performances make the story feel authentic, even when parts of it might not be. That's the dangerous beauty of great acting. When the delivery is this good, the audience stops questioning the facts. They stop asking, did this really happen? And start saying, it feels like it happened. And feeling in this life and in that life is powerful. Feeling convinces people faster than truth ever does. What Scorsese did and what these actors helped him do is slow everything down. No flashy gunfights, no glorified chaos, just time passing, favors owed, debts piling up, relationships rotting quietly. That part is honest. That grind, that erosion of the soul, that's what sticks with you. Not the violence, but the waiting for it, the knowing it's coming. De Niro's performance carries that weight all the way through. You see a guy who made choices and kept making them until one day there was nothing left but the consequences. So yeah, from a performance standpoint, this thing is top tier. These guys earn every minute they're on screen. They make you lean in, they make you trust them. And that's exactly why you have to be careful. Because when legends tell a story this well, you might forget to ask who benefits from you believing it. Now here's where things get interesting, because this is the part nobody likes to talk about. The difference between how things really work and how Hollywood needs them to work. Movies need clean arcs. They need heroes, villains, loyalty, betrayal, all wrapped up nice so you can digest it in 3 hours and walk away feeling like you understand the life. But that life doesn't explain itself. It doesn't come with narration, and it definitely doesn't hand you the truth just because you're watching closely. When I'm watching this story unfold, I'm not just looking at what's happening, I'm looking at what's being left out, what's being simplified, and what's being rearranged to make the puzzle fit. That's not a knock on filmmaking, that's just reality. A real criminal world is messy, contradictory, and full of people protecting themselves even years later. Nobody tells a story like this without an angle. Nobody. The movie wants you to believe everything happens in straight lines. One decision leads cleanly to another. One man is at the center of everything. That's comforting for an audience. In real life, it's chaos. Too many egos, too many bosses, too many crews stepping on each other's toes. Power shifts quietly, deals change overnight, and most of the people who survive long enough to tell the story do so because they were careful about what they said and what they didn't. Hollywood also loves the idea of the trusted outsider. The guy who moves between worlds, who sees everything, who's indispensable. That's a great character. But in reality, trust is thin, temporary, and conditional. You're trusted until you're not. You're valuable until you're replaceable. Nobody is as central as movies make them seem, because no organization that survives puts all its secrets in one set of hands. That's not smart, and this life rewards smart longer than it rewards brave. What really happens over time is quieter and uglier. Relationships rot, alliances fade, people turn distant without ever saying why. You don't get big confrontations, you get phone calls that stop coming. You get meetings you're suddenly not invited to. That kind of erosion doesn't play well on screen, so it gets reshaped into moments that feel dramatic instead of moments that feel true. And here's the thing. When you've lived around that world, you can feel the difference. You can sense when a scene is emotionally honest but structurally convenient. You can tell when a story is being told from the safest possible angle. Not safest for the audience, safest for the storyteller, because memory is flexible and legacy matters, especially when the story is the last thing a man leaves behind. So when I watch this, I don't dismiss it, but I don't swallow it whole either. I respect the craft, I respect the performances, but I keep one foot planted in reality. Because once you've seen how stories are used, to justify, to minimize, to elevate, you learn that the most convincing version isn't always the most accurate one. And that's where the real reaction begins, not with what the movie shows you, but with what it quietly asks you to believe. This is where the whole thing really starts to wobble for me. Because at the center of this story is one man's word. And in that life, a man's word is never just his word. It's his shield, his excuse, his version of events shaped by time, fear, and self-preservation. Confessions sound powerful, especially when they come late, when there's nothing left to lose. But that doesn't automatically make them true. Sometimes it just means the consequences are finally off the table. The movie asks you to accept that this guy was everywhere, involved in everything, trusted with secrets that would have put entire organizations at risk if they leaked. That's a heavy lift. Not impossible, but improbable. This life runs on compartmentalization. You don't hand one person the keys to every room. You spread things out. You protect yourself by limiting who knows what. That's how it survives as long as it does. And then there's the timing. Funny how clarity always shows up at the end, when memories can't be challenged, when the people who could contradict the story are gone. That's convenient, real convenient, because the dead don't argue back and paperwork doesn't talk. All that's left is a narrative, and narratives are easy to polish when no one's left to scratch them. What really makes you stop and think are the details that don't line up, not the big emotional beats. Those are easy to sell, but the logistics. Who would have allowed this? Who would have trusted that? Who benefits from this version of events being accepted as truth? Those are the questions that matter, and those are the ones the film doesn't linger on. Because if it did, the story would start to crack. Now, I'm not saying everything is made up. That's not how lies usually work. The best ones are built on real moments, real relationships, real settings. You mix truth with exaggeration, sprinkle in just enough authenticity, and suddenly the whole thing feels solid. That's how you get people to stop questioning. That's how you turn a questionable claim into accepted history. There's also something else at play here: ego. Nobody wants to believe they were just another piece on the board. Everybody wants to matter. Everybody wants their life to add up to something bigger than it was. And when you tell a story enough times, especially to people who want to believe it, it starts to feel real even to the person telling it. The movie treats these confessions like a burden carried in silence for decades, like a man haunted by what he's done. That's powerful cinema. But remorse can be complicated. Sometimes it's genuine. Sometimes it's performative. Sometimes it's just another way to control the narrative when control is the only thing you have left. And here's the dangerous part. Once a story gets stamped with prestige, with legendary actors and a master director, it stops being questioned. It becomes the version. People repeat it. Documentaries reference it. Conversations build on it. And suddenly a claim becomes a cornerstone, even if it was shaky from the start. That's why this isn't just about one man's honesty. It's about how easily we accept a story when it's told well enough, and how rarely we stop to ask whether the truth needed a little more silence than spotlight. There's another layer to all this that goes beyond one man's story, and that's the way movies like this turn a dirty, brutal world into something almost poetic. Hollywood's been doing it forever. Slow music, careful lighting, meaningful looks. Men talking about loyalty like it's some sacred code instead of a business arrangement that expires the minute it stops being useful. And look, I get it. Nobody's lining up to watch 2 hours of paperwork, paranoia, and guys slowly realizing they're disposable, so the myth gets polished. What you see on screen is a version of the life that feels dignified. The suits fit just right, the conversations sound important. The violence, when it happens, feels necessary, almost justified. It's framed as consequence, not chaos. That's not an accident, that's storytelling. Because if you showed it the way it really was, sloppy, fearful, petty, and often stupid, it wouldn't be glamorous, it wouldn't feel epic, it would feel sad. The truth is, most of this life is waiting around, worrying about who's talking, who's getting greedy, who's getting nervous. It's not honor-bound knights sitting around deciding fate. It's insecure men protecting territory and ego, making short-term decisions with long-term damage. But movies don't survive on that kind of ugliness, so they reshape it. They give it structure. They give it meaning. And once you add meaning, people start rooting for it. They start seeing these guys as tragic figures instead of what they really were, participants in something that chewed people up and didn't care who it spit out. The myth makes it feel like everyone knew the rules, like everyone accepted the risks. That's not how it worked. Plenty of people didn't sign up for what happened to them. Plenty of families paid for decision they never made. What's clever about this film is how subtle it is. It doesn't scream glorification, it whispers it. It tells you, look how empty this life becomes, while still making you admire the men who lived it. That's a tightrope, and it's easy to fall off. You leave feeling sad for them, reflective about them, maybe even respectful of them, and that's where the myth tightens its grip. Because once you start feeling that way, you stop asking harder questions. You stop asking who got hurt along the way, who disappeared without a soundtrack, who didn't get a reflective ending. The myth centers the men who survive long enough to tell the story, not the ones who vanish quietly with no narrator to remember them. And here's the thing. Myths protect people. They soften edges. They turn responsibility into inevitability. This is just how it was. This is how the life works. That kind of thinking takes weight off individual choices and spreads it across some imaginary system that no one person controlled. But every move was made by someone. Every order came from a mouth. Every silence was a decision. The longer these myths live, the harder they are to challenge. They become reference points. They become the default version of history. And once that happens, truth has to fight twice as hard just to be heard. Because it's messier and less satisfying than the story people already fell in love with. So when you watch this, enjoy the craft, admire the filmmaking, but don't confuse the myth for the lesson, because the real damage always hides behind the parts that look the most elegant. There's the thing people underestimate. Lies don't usually sound like lies. If they did, nobody would believe them. Lies sound reasonable. They sound emotional. They sound like memory. And when you dress them up with great acting, careful pacing, and a tone that feels reflective instead of defensive, they don't just pass. They settle in. They feel earned. This movie understands that. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't try to shock you every 5 minutes. It lets scenes breathe. It lets silence do the talking. And silence is powerful, because silence feels honest. When a man pauses before answering, you assume he's thinking, when in reality, sometimes he's calculating. That difference matters, but on screen, it's almost impossible to tell. The performances help sell that feeling. You watch a face age. You watch regret creep in. You watch loneliness replace confidence, and your brain fills in the gaps for you. You think, why would someone lie about this after all that time? That's the trick. Time doesn't make people honest. Time just changes what honesty costs. Good storytelling doesn't hit you with facts. It pulls you into perspective. You're not being told this is true. You're being shown how it felt to believe it was true. And once you feel something, logic takes a back seat. You stop cross-checking. You stop asking who else was there, who might disagree, who benefits from this version surviving. You're emotionally invested now. Another thing the movie does well is consistency. The story doesn't contradict itself, and that's important. Consistency feels like truth, but consistency can be rehearsed. Repetition smooths rough edges. If you tell the same story enough times, especially without interruption, it starts to sound solid. That's not roof. That's practice. And let's be honest. People want to believe this stuff. They want the puzzle to make sense. They want history to have a narrator. Randomness is uncomfortable. Chaos doesn't satisfy. A single voice guiding you through decades of darkness feels reassuring, even if it's misleading. It gives meaning to things that might not have had any. There's also the credibility borrowed from the people telling the story. When legends put their weight behind a narrative, it carries authority. You trust the voice because you trust the messenger. You assume someone checked the details, challenged the claims, balanced the account. But films aren't courtrooms. They don't need proof. They need coherence. That's why lies in movies don't feel like deception. They feel like interpretation. This is how I remember it. This is how it felt. And once you accept feeling as currency, accuracy becomes optional. Emotional truth replaces factual truth. And nobody complains because the experience was powerful, but power cuts both ways. A well-told story doesn't just entertain, it teaches. It shapes how people talk about the past. It decides who looks important, who looks peripheral, and who disappears entirely. And once that story becomes the reference point, challenging it feels like nitpicking instead of correction. That's why you've got to stay awake while you're watching. Appreciate the craft, feel the weight, but don't surrender your judgment, because the most convincing lies are the ones that never ask for your trust. They just quietly take it. When all is said and done, what really matters isn't whether you liked a movie or not. It's what you walk away believing. For the credits roll. Because films like this don't just entertain, they educate by accident. For a lot of people, this becomes the history lesson. This becomes the reference point. Years from now, someone's going to bring up a name, an event, a moment, and this is the version they're going to picture. Not because it was proven, but because it was powerful. That's the responsibility that comes with this kind of storytelling. When you mix real people, real deaths, real consequences with a polished narrative, you're not just telling a story, you're shaping memory. And memory is fragile. It bends toward the most confident voice in the room. It favors the version that feels complete, even if it isn't. The legacy of movies like this isn't just about the actors or the director. It's about what they leave behind in the public imagination. Who gets framed as central? Who gets reduced to background noise? Who becomes a footnote? And who becomes a legend? Those decisions matter because once they're made, they're hard to undo. And look, I'm not saying audiences are dumb. People know movies take liberties. But repetition has a way of sanding down skepticism. When a story gets retold enough times, quoted enough times, referenced enough times, it stops being a movie version and starts being what happened. That's how myths graduate into accepted truth. That's why the audience has a role here too. Watching something critically doesn't mean ruining it. It means respecting it enough to question it. It means enjoying the performances, admiring the craftsmanship, while still leaving room for doubt, because doubt is healthy. Doubt keeps history honest. There's also something deeper going on beneath all of this, a fascination with closure. People want endings. They want to believe everything adds up, that lives like these resolve into neat conclusions. Real life doesn't work that way. A lot of things end unresolved. A lot of questions never get answered. Movies hate that. Audiences hate that. So stories fill in the blanks. But every blank you fill comes with a cost. It simplifies, it smooths, it turns sharp edges into themes. And sometimes it gives too much grace to people who didn't earn it, while ignoring the people who paid the price without ever getting a scene. That's why it's important to remember, history isn't owned by the best storyteller. It's owned by the facts, even when the facts are boring, uncomfortable, or incomplete. And when entertainment steps into that space, it carries weight whether it wants to or not. So if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. Admire the art, respect the performances, but don't hand over your understanding of the past without asking who's shaping it and why. Because once a story becomes legacy, changing it is a lot harder than believing it.